Welcome to Race Matters. I am your co-host, Jeff Baker, and I'm joined by my co-host, Eddie Carson. And like we do every episode, we're leaning into the nomenclature of exploring race, class, gender, culture, and those issues that may seem to divide us, but also allow us space to listen, learn, and to bridge our divides. We're coming to you from WJOP, Joppa Radio, FM 96.3 in Newburyport, Massachusetts.
Folks, as we do every week, we're excited to really engage into a conversation. And we're really excited about the guest that we have today, really one of the foremost scholars in the country when it comes to elements of thinking about race and culture and religion and society. We have with us Professor Reggie Williams. And Dr. Williams is a professor of theological studies at St. Louis University. He specializes particularly in thinking about things such as African-American thought, Black studies, Black theology. His work has really led him to do some outstanding scholarship, folks, when it comes to Dietrich Bonhoeffer and how he explores and wrestles with Christian ethics. Professor Williams published an outstanding book that I've had the chance to read a couple times in the past, titled Bonhoeffer's Black Jesus, Harlem Renaissance Theology and an Ethic Resistance. And this book, won some awards, highly praised, and those elements that's there. He's published in peer-reviewed journals, essays at the Christian Century magazine. So I'm going to step back and welcome Professor Williams to the fold, brother. How you doing?
I'm good, brother. So good to be on your show here, on your podcast. Thank you for the invitation.
My friend, we're excited to have you here. And one of the things we want to do is really kind of get a chance for you to connect with our audience and our listeners and everything too. If you don't mind, tell us a little bit about your background. Where are you from and in your sojourn, right? What has led you to this particular place in your academic the way you've credentialized yourself academically, now being housed at St. Louis University?
Sure. Well, I'm born and raised in California. Off air, we were talking about that a little bit. I went to raised in really a suburb of the California Bay Area, and then went to college and grad school in Southern California. And for quite a number of years, I would narrate my life up to this point as just someone just trying to be Christian. Labels didn't really mean a whole lot to me. I didn't understand actually the label evangelical, although I was inside of evangelical institutions. I didn't really understand what that meant. I was simply trying to be Christian. And for a number of years, what was on the required reading list was the content that we had to know, and to do well in the class, you got to know that stuff very, very well. But to have it be relevant to me meant to study content that was either, if it made it on the recommended reading list, wasn't as regarded as the content that was on the required reading list, where, the presentation was that the academy was made up of elite white minds only. So it was in the context of engaging that content, recommended, or stuff that I would put together. I did an essay once, an undergrad, reading Jürgen Moltmann alongside of trickster narratives from African American stories of Anansi the spider and so forth, and Brer Rabbit. But that wasn't even on the recommended reading list. I'm just trying to have this make sense for me and the history that I bring to the content that I'm reading in the required courses. That brought me to really, in many respects, the study that I did of Dietrich Bonhoeffer when I was a PhD student. Although my mentor made it very clear that Bonhoeffer was an important person to study. Mm-hmm. He also led me to Bonhoeffer's time in Harlem. But I took that very seriously because I was fascinated that he was in Harlem, and did my own study of that, which was a bit like Jürgen Moltmann and Brer Rabbit.
Could you could you tell us and could you tell our listeners as we dive into this just a little bit of basic background about Dietrich Bonhoeffer and his time in Germany, his time in New York, and I think especially his time at Abyssinian Baptist?
Sure, sure. It's important to recognize that figures like him are so very vital to our interpretation of what we're doing in the world today because he's a Western theologian, one of the top theologians of the 20th century, situated within a fascist regime, trying to make sense of what it means to be Christian. And he's not beholden to whatever is happening politically. His commitments are to his faith, which is not what Christian nationalism is. And he's dealing with a version of that in Germany. So Dietrich Bonhoeffer is a wealthy German. He's a man born one of 8 children to a family where mom didn't work and dad was a breadwinner. Mom was it was aristocracy, part of the German aristocracy. Dad was Bildungsbürgertum, which means educated upperclassmen. The educated upper class was not royalty, so one might perceive mom as somewhat being rebellious when she married this working class man. But that wasn't the case exactly. It wasn't the case. Um, he's from a class of people who understood themselves to be responsible for the maintenance of German culture and society by arts and education. He was a brilliant pianist, the youngest of 4 boys. He had a twin sister. He was born 10 minutes before his twin sister Sabine. She was one of 4 girls. Not the youngest, Susanna was the youngest. Ursula, Christine, Sabine, and Susanna were the name of the girls, and called Friedrich, Walter, Klaus, and Bonhoeffer, and Dietrich. I'm sorry, Dietrich was the boys. So it's a very wealthy family. Dad is the head of Charité Hospital, which is a psychiatric wing of the University of Berlin. And Dietrich gets a PhD at age 21, educated in the after-war period. During World War I, he had a brother die, Walter, the second eldest. And if you know a family a family where a child has died, family that's lost a child, you know it is devastating and significantly transformative for that family. Walter's death changed everybody. Dietrich carried Walter's confirmation Bible after Walter's funeral, after Walter's passing. He carried it for the rest of his life. And it was indeed after Walter's passing that Dietrich declared in a family that in fact did not go to church, by the
Mm.
way. It's important to recognize that. They didn't go to church. Most of them were not Christian. Mom had some Moravian Christian background, so she led some Bible studies at home, but it was not a Christian family, not a church-going family. After Walter's death, Dietrich declares that he wants to be a theologian, and he carries Walter's Bible for the rest of his life. So they come from a community in which Christianity and church was a part of that upper middle class culture, weddings, funerals, catechisms, and so forth. But it really didn't say anything to everyday life. It was compartmentalized.
Speaking, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, no, that's it. I was just going to say that when he heads to New York, things change.
Yeah, well, it's interesting too, because speaking of, compartmentalizing everything, I kind of have 2 questions. One, well, let me start with this one, then I'll delve into the second one. Did you have to delve into a lot of the archives in Germany as part of your work, or was most of your scholarship and research in the archives here in the States?
Both. But it wasn't necessary to go to dig into the archives in Germany because I'm a part of the International Dietrich Bonhoeffer Society. We have 17 volumes of his entire literary estate translated into English. It's all there in English. So I did go and look at some of the German
Mhm.
in the German archives. Some of it was held at Union Seminary, in fact, in German. And I came back to you can see on my shelf, the blue.
Mm-hmm.
Those are the Bonhoeffer archives there. All of that is in English, his its entire literary estate. Um, They come back and look at the Bonhoeffer archives, and it's all right there.
Yes. I mean, that's fascinating. And, and the fact, of course, too, that I believe I'm correct here, and correct me if I'm wrong. Bonhoeffer held a professorship at Union Theological. Am I correct?
Well, it was offered to him.
Okay.
It was offered to him. He could not take it. They were trying to get him out of Germany into safety in 1939, just before the war started. And he came over for 3 weeks. He couldn't take it. He just decided not to because he was still tutoring, I should say, mentoring people in Germany. And he wanted to be a part of the restoration of Christianity in Germany. He felt like he couldn't do that from a distance. So no, he did not take the job at Union.
Okay. Right. Thinking about that moral justice and that attitude, and one of the reasons why many of us, right, like thinking about Bonhoeffer and everything too. And and I talk about this idea of thinking about Dietrich Bonhoeffer because, as the three of us know, there's been a lot of appropriations when it comes to Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and there's been some fighting even among. We go back to that early word that you talked about, Professor Williams, early on about evangelical people who are now saying that Dietrich Bonhoeffer has been. People have been hoodwinked by the fact that he's not this great leader, this great faith-based leader, because he organized a plot against Adolf Hitler and really tried to take down the government of fascism that's there. And you've seen this even in Hollywood films and interpretations and these arguments. I'd love to get your thoughts on Bonhoeffer and what's happening in his world. And not surprising that a lot of the stuff with Bonhoeffer that's taking place right now is happening amidst the strange Christian nationalism, cultural wars that we're all experiencing and inundated with right now.
Sure. Well, it's important to know that this kind of appropriation is common with a popular historical figure. It's no exception to the rule with Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Um, let's start in this way. After the end of World War II, when armies were liberating concentration camps, Germany saw Dietrich Bonhoeffer and the people who were part of Operation Valkyrie, people who were opposing the government. Germany saw them all as traitors. He was not popular. Not too long afterwards, however, he became popular when it was very clear that the Nazis were sadistic and evil. People like Klaus von Stauffenberg and Dietrich Bonhoeffer and Sophie and Eric, the Scholl brother and sister, White Rose, people like that. Remember, numbers of people who are part of resistance in Germany became heroes. Whole museum set up to them in Berlin at the Bendler Block, the place where Klaus von Stauffenberg was killed when Operation Valkyrie failed. Bonhoeffer then became a national hero. He's not just a Christian icon. There are hotels and schools named for him in Germany. Okay. He's a national hero. He becomes a Christian hero once the letters and papers from prison become public in 1967, I mean, in the 1960s, because of Eberhard Bethge. Don't hold me accountable for the exact year. I know it's the 1960s when Bethge publicizes the correspondence that they were sharing between while he was in prison. So he becomes popular then. Now, as a global popular figure, like Martin Luther King Jr., like Jesus, people appropriate that figure for whatever political agenda they have. He is no different.
Mm.
Fact of the matter is, he would not be accepted by people on the right today because he straight up opposed the right. Nazis, they folks who appropriate Bonhoeffer for the right narrow in on the word socialism.
Mhm.
The National Socialists, Nazis, NSDAP, the Nazi regime, the National Socialists. National Socialism is not the same as democratic socialism. Socialism can consider that as an umbrella term, right? And you have your far right socialists, Nazis. And Dietrich never claimed to be a socialist of any kind, but he certainly opposed the Nazis, risking his life, in fact, knowing full well that this may mean his death. He is not one of them. Early on, or after his return from Germany, I'm sorry, his return from the United States, comes back to Germany, and he's arguing for the presence of what do you call it? Um, the lawyers who tend to sit on the far left. Um, it's gonna come to me. I can't believe I'm forgetting their names right now.
I'm a lawyer, so I want to know who these people are.
I'm full well. Once I say their names, you're gonna know who I'm talking about. The
German lawyers?
No, they're in the United States. They tend to advocate for people who are marginalized and outcast.
Was it the National Lawyers Guild?
Not the National Lawyers
No.
Guild.
Okay. ACLU? We'll get there.
ACLU.
ACLU.
Sure.
I got you.
I can't believe I forgot that.
That's all right.
That happens to me. It happened in class today. Trust me.
The American Civil Liberties Union, yes.
He's mentioning the American Civil Liberties Union by name and saying we need an ACLU here in Germany. That's when he returned upon his return from the United States.
I'm happy to hear that. Can I this is fascinating. I'd like to take it back a beat when you talked about his escape in 1939 as being a traitor, or a traitor by the lights of the Nazi regime and the ascendant Germans. I read an excerpt from you. I don't know if it's in the book of your dissertation today when I was preparing, where you talked about how he grew up in a Lutheran sense, a theological Lutheran sense that justified a sense, and this is of course like ancient regime European thought of thinking in terms of orders. And you even mentioned it just then, describing the family. There's the aristocracy, there's this order, there's that order, and propped up by a theology, in this case Lutheran theology, but I think we see it throughout. I'm an Anglican now, but I grew up in the Churches of Christ, and I know back in the antebellum era, the Episcopal Church and others propped up a sense of white supremacy and all of these things. So I say that as background, like he grew up in an era, not even a Nazi era, but just a Western European era that had a theological underpinning that justified a sense of orders in society: lower class, middle class, working class, nobility, aristocracy. And it seems to me that his protest, transformative protest, perhaps in Harlem, took root against not only Nazism but also against that theology, which is not uncommon, and was not the sharp edge of National Socialism, but was really sort of German self-identity. So I guess my question to you is, when and how, if I'm correct in all of that, and you were nodding, so thank you. When and how did he come to begin to question that? And then how did that translate into not only a resistance against Nazism, but a real concern about that theological underpinning?
You see the language of orders of creation in the United States, in the U.S. South. It is an argument for the practice of enslavement. Okay. Orders of creation, God's order of creation. It's the same content that the Nazis were using, orders of creation, to argue for a hierarchy of white races and a hierarchy of the white races over all other races, and spread of civilization, the maintenance of culture, and the scientific advancement of humankind. They're using this language of orders of creation in a theological sense to name hierarchy. And the Aryan is the apotheosis of the white races. Dietrich is using and I should say also, but this is in the context of a folkish movement that begins in 1871 with the birth of the nation, and only ends with the defeat of the Nazis in 1945. This folkish movement. So he's actually educated as a theologian in his very folkish centered ethnic nationalism. He's when he becomes a theologian. So he's using the language of orders of creation in in the 1920s.
So
He
if I
used
may, where was the German church deriving that as a theological matter? What was the theological justification for that from their point of view, or do they have a theological root in that?
well, it's difficult to name it as a German church orientation. It's kind of a cultural ethos.
Okay, okay,
Um, so it's certainly present within the churches. Dietrich names it in a set of lectures that he gives in 1929. He states this, the divine orders of creation and placing my people at the forefront of my responsibility, the order of things. It would be irresponsible of me to place my enemy first. He's talking about the role of the teachings of Christ, and specifically, he's talking about like a pacifism and so forth. That is irresponsible to place my enemy above my folk, the folk. This is the folkish movement. That is the divine order of things, the orders of creation, that we must love the folk. And he also says about the folk that they are an ascendant people. Um, he's placing this language of the folk that, you know, it's natural that some folk are taken over by other folk, you know, their youth and their power and so forth. Here I'm paraphrasing. But he's speaking in this language of folkishness. He heads over to the United States, and that very language is prominent in the South. It is the structure of segregation. It's the argument for enslavement. Now, when he makes the transition, it's hard to put your finger on, but you hear it immediately when he publishes the lectures Creation and Fall. There he's speaking in opposition to language of creation, of orders of creation, and he instead uses the language of orders of preservation. The language orders of creation speaks of a created situation that is organized by God at creation and maintained by human participation in it. But orders of preservation is God's active grace, God's active role in creation. And they are all preserved for Christ. So he's against the orders of creation and speaking about God's continued practice of engagement and not in terms of hierarchy. But he even abandons orders of preservation by the time he gets to his posthumously published Ethics in 1942 when he's writing that. There he only speaks about mandates. He jettisons the entire language of orders completely and speaks about mandates then. Now I should mention, however, that though he's wrestling with this content in his formative history as a theologian, the question we should be asking is whether or not he actually arrives at that place that he might be wanting, this equal space, this place of equity, this place of non-hierarchy. Does he actually arrive there in his own thinking?
That's interesting. And, in thinking about this, I'd love for you to kind of to help us understand, help the audience understand, where does Bonhoeffer's sense of racial justice come into the fold, that sense of interracialness, understanding it was happening back in Germany. He arrives, right, and he's really kind of engulfed with, particularly within a Black community, and analyzing and really critiquing and drawing conclusions about the struggles of Black folks, which you've written about. And we know, of course, the Crisis magazine by Du Bois, who's editing that for a period of time, and you made a number of references in your work about that. So you see that sense of interracialness, this white brother who understands the importance of interracialness. And and I'm going to go ahead and say this before you delve into that. Two of my all-time favorite white mentors, Dietrich Bonhoeffer is one of those, and the other one is going to be James Reeb, the UU minister, who went to the South to die for the souls of Black folks with King. And I do. I put those two brothers on pedestals. So yeah, I'd love to hear that interracial critique, which I think is so pivotal, especially here in the 21st century.
Sure, sure. How does he engage in this interracial critique? Does he engage in interracial critique? I think we can put a lot of things in Dietrich's mouth, actually. A lot of these arguments, a lot of these moments in Dietrich's mouth, but it's questionable whether or not does he actually engage in them.
Mm.
You might, yeah, it's I'm not sure if I first let me back up and say, Jeff, did I answer your question?
Yes, and as you respond to Eddie's, I'm very, very curious about your explanation of his pathway through the Black church in Harlem, and then how that affects all of these questions.
So you go to Harlem today to Abyssinian Baptist Church, and you see a bunch of German people. They'll visit in the second service, and they'll come on Wednesdays. Somebody sells that as part of a gospel tour.
Mhm.
And some of the services are just overwhelmed with visitors. And it's crazy how many of them are German. And they may not even know that Dietrich Bonhoeffer visited there. It's just a kind of a common German trait to come and visit Harlem, or to travel, when they have their built-in vacation time in their year, their annual, every year they have these blocks, like the French do, blocks of vacation, which are definitely vacation time. We don't do anything, we travel. They come to Harlem and they'll visit these churches. And they visit these black churches, very, very German. Dietrich was no different, except I mean, he's reading Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin when he's a kid, right? Um, his grandmother is really interested in him going to India and studying with Gandhi, spending time with Gandhi. In fact, before he was hoping to go see India on his way to the United States. Didn't happen. And he also tried to set it up on the way back to Germany from the United States. Didn't happen. Only happened in 1935 when he wrote to Gandhi about getting accepted in his ashram. Gandhi writes back, "Yeah, come on over if you can live in the way we're doing, we're fine to have you." And then he gets pressed into service for the Confessing Church and takes over the Confessing Church Seminary at Finkenwald, where we get life together and discipleship from. And he doesn't get to go, never gets to study with Gandhi. That's on his radar as a high priority for most of his life.
Mm.
Okay. Instead, he makes his way into the United States, spends the majority, one of his friends in the United States, Paul Lehman, says he spent nearly all of his free time in Harlem. He's looking for something, as he'll tell us later. He's looking for something. He calls it a cloud of witnesses on one hand, and in his letter to Gandhi, he's looking for a practice to resist totalitarianism successfully. In the letter to Gandhi in 1935, he laments that he didn't find it in the United States. What you find in the United States is a precursor to the civil rights movement, in which Martin Luther King Jr. is, in fact, that United States Gandhi,
Mhm.
according to advocates of the social gospel. They thought it was Thurman. Thurman wasn't acting politically enough. They
Mhm.
got it in Martin Luther King Jr. This nonviolent reliance on satyagraha to resist totalitarianism. That comes in the 50s and 60s. In the 30s, when Dietrich is there, you don't have the argument for, I mean, the practices of nonviolence to resist totalitarianism. What you have is a direct engagement with the human being, not a biological reference, but an idea that needs its contrast to be recognizable to itself. Black is always that contrast. And in the Harlem Renaissance, you've got people looking to recalibrate it because it has been held tightly. They've refused to recalibrate it after the Civil War. And Black people have been languishing under that. So in the Harlem Renaissance, he comes into a movement that's looking to recalibrate the notion of human. And that's a struggle for Dietrich. That's a struggle for him. He doesn't recognize how human is at work in his own theology. What he's recognizing actually is the effects of it: oppression, abuse, hierarchy. These things are on his radar. He comes into Harlem and he becomes a member of Abyssinian Baptist Church, I should say, a lay leader at Abyssinian. I don't know if he actually became a member. He becomes a lay leader there. He's teaching Bible school, I'm sorry, Bible study to women on Wednesdays. He's teaching Sunday school to boys on Sunday mornings and and he stays there. He's during the Great Depression and the context of the Harlem Renaissance. Dietrich is in black Harlem, and he's 24 years old, experiencing life out of the country, living there permanently. I mean, living there for extended period of time in the end of his student years. This moment is tremendously impactful for him. It becomes for him an experience with the world that he knows in a world that he does not know. Harlem, United States. Experience of the world from the perspective of people who are harmed by white supremacy.
Yeah.
I know this might be speculative, but I imagine that was not an experience that, had he been a white theologian, that he probably would have experienced or had the same kind of entree. Do you think that he may have been treating that somewhat anthropologically, like I want to go learn and see and explore, or do you suppose that he was like genuinely like, these are my people, I see the gospel here?
I mean, so your question is a brilliant one. On one hand, I'll put it like this. The anthropological one is one he could not avoid. He's white, and he's formed in white Western Europe, in the white West. So he's got this concept of gathering knowledge from the encounters that he's having with other people, and he's formulating an idea of who these people are. That's standard. That's very white. Okay. On the other hand, as he states it, as a theologian, he's trying to find a meaning of the gospel that matters for every part of life, not just catechism and weddings and funerals. He's coming from a Germany in the context of Great Depression, and where people are jumping off bridges and stuff. They don't have food enough to eat. People are wearing clothes made of cloth and paper. And the church has nothing to say about that. He's looking for a representation of the gospel that will speak to that. And he finds the Black social gospel speaking to the entirety of life. As he puts it, one's whole body is under the gospel. And that becomes important to him. That does become important to him. He says, he's writing back to the person in charge of his ordination process, says, I've heard the gospel spoken only once, and that was by a Negro. Like, shocked. But it's the church that he starts to attend.
A question, and just kind of hearing you and how you've just really kind of just opened the theological aspects and thinking about Bonhoeffer, and I tend to view him a little bit more from a historical lens. I have this thing that I do, and one of these things that I do is for a long period in my life, going back probably before when I was in high school, I would say probably up until recent. Thinking about my working manuscript is I tend to ignore kind of the sins of those that I put on a pedestal, and really kind of focus on the heroification of those things that we tend to uplift. What would you say was, understanding he's human, what was Bonhoeffer's sin that he wrestled with, he struggled with, particularly through all of these dynamics that's there? If you could point to one sin or two sins or anything that you've come across in your own scholarship that made you just pause and say, okay, this is interesting. What would you say that is?
That's a brilliant question. People, when we talk about sin, we're usually talking about interpersonal failures. Usually, in Christians in the United States, especially evangelicals, tend to be hyper-focused on sex. Sexual sin, hyper-focused on that. This is not an issue that he talks about. It's just not. In fact, you'll never hear him talking about homosexuality. At least not that I've found at all. Or even his interpersonal sexuality. So put that on one side. So not that. You don't hear him talking a whole lot about financial exploitation or any regard that financial exploitation would be a social sin. But personal, interpersonal things, you don't really hear him talking about that so much. Sin for him is something different. Sin for him is outside or away from the one who makes us human. That's Bonhoeffer's interpretation of sin. That my encounter with my neighbor should be one in which they are invited to be human and invited to be human, participate to make them more human would be to bring them into Christ. It's a condition of one's being for him, you might say. That's how he interprets it. Those of us looking at him, interpreting him, as the text that I'm working on right now would have us question, what does it mean by human in general? That Christ makes us that Christ is that. Again, what I'd said earlier, what's happening in Harlem is a recalibration of the very concept of human itself. And as he comes in with this anthropological kind of disposition, does he get that? This is where I would locate his sin. What is he capable of seeing? What do the eyes that Bonhoeffer is formed with allow him to see? There's a deeper text going on in Harlem than the one he reads. You might say that he's still holding tightly onto the European idea of the human. He still believes that Europe has a people-making, world-making function, that it is the manifestation of Christ in the world, and that the spread of civilization and humanity as such comes from Europe.
Mm.
One might say that, Dietrich, you recognize, as you talked about in 1942, in this whole perspective from suffering, when he makes the claim that we see things that we recognize good and so forth from the perspective of suffering, from the view from below is what he's describing it. But this is important, right? This matters. Yet when you talk about the presence of Christ in the world, Christ is manifest in this Ethics as Formation, which is the second chapter, is posthumously published Ethics, that Christ is manifest as the unified Europe and Americas, the colonizers, the imperialists. And this he's writing near the end of his life. He hasn't been able to shake that. Why not? Given what he said in 1942, recognize Christ in this view from below. That this is where Christ is at in the world, not in the colonizers, but in the perspective of the people who are harmed by the colonizers. Wouldn't that make more sense?
That's powerful, brother. Absolutely. Oh, absolutely.
Not where he's at.
Your work, and I think identifies, and it's in the title of your book, the ethics of resistance. And you speak of like the need, I believe you're talking about, correct me if I'm wrong, of course. And actually you're a scholar of Bonhoeffer, and that's fine. And I want you to be able to translate Bonhoeffer for us, but I'm also very, very interested in what you believe too, and what you think, and where your own theology is. You talk about obedience requiring concrete historical action, uh, as an outflow of an incarnational ethics. And eventually that led Bonhoeffer to dramatic action against the Nazis. But as I'm hearing you say it, that was a critique against the Nazis. But within this worldview that may not yet have gotten to a place of full admission of Black humanity or non-Western, non-colonial humanity, where would you pick that up today in our current context to talk about how he or you articulate that theological grounded ethics of resistance? And then how does it manifest?
That's so brilliant.
Yeah.
This is good. That's a good question. That's a good question. So I
It had a
can,
long it had a long windup. I should have edited it, but I appreciate your answer if it can come.
well, that's good. You just need to, it's just, we'll come back to whether or not I've answered your question.
Okay.
Spoken here. That's a really good question. So I'm going to narrow in on perspective on theological resistance today.
Sure.
Theological.
Thank you. Yeah, yeah.
Um, One of the things that is most important is to surface what I'm talking about is presumption of human. It animates the way we see community, the right community. It animates the notion, our practice of politics. It animates what we understand about God's work is in the world, what we understand is God's work in the world. Human beings are the focus of God's created order. What we mean by human matters infinitely. It just matters so much. And what we have in Bonhoeffer's work and in much of what we do in theological studies is an idea that is European. Call it a cultural specific formation that needs an opposite in order to be legible to itself. Okay. This is standard. And that resistance today means surfacing that and acting in opposition to it. What would complete otherness mean to that human? This human is set up what we know as harmful politics, Christian nationalism, and even harmful theology from those of us who, from people who would identify themselves as progressive, yet they don't recognize them, like Dietrich, who don't recognize themselves working with the very tools that organize all of the problems that we're facing, all of the isms and all of the phobias, that notion of human is itself the obstacle.
Mm.
That's the obstacle. Can we imagine? And one way that people get at it is by talking about whiteness. Whiteness is not a it's not a quality of any demographic of people. White people and whiteness, one might say, and one interpretation of whiteness, yeah, I can see that. But the way I'm working with whiteness is not that. It's not something that belongs, it's a quality of white people. White people have a different relationship to whiteness than
Mm.
black people do, but we are all seeped in whiteness. Whiteness is an epistemology. Whiteness is a way of knowing the world and ourselves in it. It organizes a hierarchy of being that places white people, that invents white people, black, brown, yellow, so forth, and it structures hierarchy. It even tells us about the rocks and the plants and so forth, right? To expose the work of whiteness and imagine something completely other, another world, one that is not organized by whiteness. That's the practice of theological education. That is the risk and the bravery of theological education to imagine something other than what was handed to us in these years of epistemological practice out of Europe.
And can you give an example? I mean, and that may be a very Western
Pardon?
that may be a very Western question, but like
No,
that is poetic and abstract. Can you
sure, sure,
locate
sure,
something in our world right now to illustrate that?
sure, 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 sure. So self-possessed rational individual. Think Descartes. I think, therefore I am. I'm self-aware. You know, I'm self-aware, and Kant he's talking about the autonomous self-possessed individual, the autonomous person, not the heteronomous person. Heteronomity is those who have laws of society imposed upon them. They need to be structured by law. But the autonomous, according to Kant, are a law unto themselves. Okay, this is the European man who is governed by rationality to recognize the good and the bad and the right and wrong in the world. They do that unto themselves. Autonomous do. But there are many people who do not have they're not autonomous. They have to have the rules applied to them. And those are the people outside of Europe. Kant, people talk about his philosophy, but he was also an anthropologist.
Mm.
Racist as all get out.
Right.
Okay. I mean, they need the laws applied to them, but the autonomous ones. Okay. Rational, self-possessed, autonomous individuals. The European idea of human that is white and male, really, right? Landowning white male. But in places like South Africa, you've got concepts of human that are Ubuntu. I'm going to say it wrong because my friends in Ghana always, I mean, they correct me often, but it's a very, it's a similar concept. They in Twi they say miye efise yeye, or I think it's mihoye efise yeye, something along those lines. But the concept is the same. It's I am because we are me, me am us, not the autonomous rational individual. That idea of human does not have global traction. It's not the global discourse because it lacks the corresponding power to reproduce itself. But what would happen if we understood human being as a collective, not as a rational individual? What if we understood ourselves as always already intertwined as opposed to individuated, antagonistic, meaning that I know myself by contrast, as opposed to I know myself as us?
That would be a paradigm shift, brother.
Yes.
I mean, hugely, and that becomes a challenge in and of itself, particularly folks who try to raise our own consciousness to understand what does that mean. But of course, the ways in which male supremacy, straight supremacy, white supremacy, all those things that interfere, the structures of capitalism continue to create barriers from reaching those particular points that are there too.
Say that, bro. I mean, it's already intertwined in the gospel language. I mean, we got God is not a single autonomous individual. God is a collective.
Yes. We are getting to the end here, this episode of Race Matters. Folks, if you're listening, we were having just an absolutely brilliant conversation with Professor Reggie Williams here at Race Matters, Jopper Radio 96.3, Newburyport, Massachusetts. And Professor Williams, Professor Baker and I, one of the things we like to do on every episode is we always like to give our guests the last word as we wrap up. And brother, and that can be about whatever, anything, work, research, book, what's on your mind, shoot. It could be about what you're about to have for dinner, my friend. You have that space. Professor Williams, you have the last sound here.
Off the top of my head, with no preparation or forethought, let me think about this for a second. So thank you for mentioning the book, Bonhoeffer's Black Jesus. Ferdinand Schlingensief recently passed away. He passed away just a few weeks ago, in fact, and he wrote he wrote the foreword to that book. In that foreword, people had asked him for a long time to write an autobiography because his father was arrested with Dietrich Bonhoeffer and Martin Niemöller. And he's a man who was deeply influenced by his father. He writes an autobiography only in that book, Bonhoeffer's Black Jesus. He's the founder of the International Dietrich Bonhoeffer Society, one of the co-founders, the catalyst for its founding. So I'd want to mention him just in his passing. Dear friend, a very, very dear friend, like a father to me as well, in many respects. His son and I did a documentary on Bonhoeffer's time in Harlem called A Cloud of Witnesses. So I'd want to highlight that as well, that documentary, Cloud of Witnesses. But more than anything, I would say this. We have our work cut out before us. Our work is cut out for us. People fail to recognize the gravity of the time that we are living because we are living it. For whatever reason, we recognize gravity in the textbooks that we read, but we fail to recognize gravity in the moments we are living. We are in a moment right now that requires us to pay attention. And a person like Dietrich Bonhoeffer is helpful to read, to study, as well as Du Bois, while we're paying attention to the moment we are in. Take it seriously and don't turn away.
Yeah, amen. Thank you, Dr. Williams.
Absolutely. Thank you, Professor Williams. Folks, I'm Eddie Carson. I'm here with Professor Jeff Baker, my co-host. Listen to Professor Reggie Williams in our discussion on Christian ethics, on Bonhoeffer, and so many wonderful things. Thank you for chiming in on Race Matters.
Thank you, dear brother. Thank you, friends. Good to speak with you.